Still on the search of that one true love? On the limbo in this crazy world of dating, marriage, relationships? Well, listen to the Golden State Media Concepts Relationship Podcast, your one-stop podcast for everything about relationships.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Golden State Media Concepts Relationships Podcast. This is episode 24, and I'll be talking a little bit about Alzheimer's and dementia. And I'm going to bring this topic up because it is something that has affected someone who is very near and dear to me and my family, and my aunt. She passed away from the disease itself. And I'm going to talk about it because I know it affects a lot of people. And I'm going to read from I always like to quote my sources here from the Bright Focus Foundation. And number one, Alzheimer's and dementia, they're not exactly the same. One is a form of the other. And because you may ask, what's the difference? And what I'm going to read to you is simply this. Many people are often confused by the terms Alzheimer's and dementia. Now, although they are used interchangeably, there are distinct differences between them. And what dementia is not a disease, but it's a group of symptoms that are associated with a decline in thinking, reasoning, and or remembering. So if someone has dementia, they may have difficulty carrying out daily tasks that they have performed routinely and independently throughout their lives. Now, two of the most common types of dementia, Alzheimer's disease and vascular dementia. And vascular dementia is the hardening of the arteries in the brain that causes the blockage in blood flow. Now, if you can imagine, if there is a reduced blood flow in the brain, there's obviously going to be a decline in not only cognitive function and the ability to do things, but that also tends to happen as we observe in people who are a little bit older. But you can imagine that if there is a decreased ability of the brain to function, that's going to affect someone. Now, these two conditions account for the vast majority of dementia cases, and both conditions are irreversible. Now, the symptoms can be managed, but I think the fact that it's irreversible, and as we observe what happens to individuals when they are afflicted by it, there seems to be a steady decline. Now, there is research on the subject as we speak on how to deal with, how to manage the symptoms. Now, the Alzheimer's disease is the most common form of dementia, and it's terminal. It's a progressive brain disorder that has no known cause or cure as of the moment. And now it slowly steals the minds of its victims, leading to memory loss, confusion, impaired judgment, personality changes, disorientation, and the inability to communicate. Now, dementia usually occurs in the mid to later stages of Alzheimer's disease. In the case of my aunt, who was affected by it, it was something that I personally had only heard about and had not experienced. But this was a woman who I had known from the time I was, before I can remember. I mean, I'm looking at pictures of her holding me, so obviously I was a baby. And she cared for me for many, many years. She was sharp, quick-witted, and just very in charge of things. And then there was the moment that I had experienced when I walked to her front door and rang the doorbell. She opens it, and there was this person, my aunt, who was standing there in front of me, seemed to be fully functioning, but she didn't recognize me. And at that moment, I didn't know if that was her sense of humor or if something else had happened. It wasn't too long after that, I was informed by my cousins that she was affected by dementia. And I had a great deal of sympathy for them and what they were going through. Not only my cousins, but my uncle, because they had been married as of her passing. They had been married well over 50 years, and again, she passed away last year. And what had happened in that experience is he had tried for many, 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 many years to care for her. And if you can imagine the amount of love and compassion you have for someone who you've experienced that much of your life with, and then to see them experience that cognitive and decline and the ability to do things, the ability to care for themselves, and almost to have that blank look when you're trying to communicate with them. So I had experienced that in just a small amount, but my aunt, who was the parent of these 4 lovely children of hers, and the partner to my uncle, again, for so many years, to see the pain that they went through, it gave me an opportunity to rethink the whole conversation about the subject and what it does. My mother, my aunt's sister, was not affected the same way. She passed away herself about 4 years ago, and I was very fortunate to have my mother fully functioning. That is, up until her illness had carried her away. So I did not experience that. But this broadcast is for those of you who have experienced it, and those who have not. When you encounter someone, let's say possibly in a grocery store, walking along the street. Now, this show deals with relationships. I deal with mental health, those kinds of things. And I'm trying to create with this podcast an awareness of what goes on out there in the world, because it's quite often with these symptoms of Alzheimer's and dementia can be very subtle initially. And the personality change is something that is, it's hard to describe at times when these transitions happen, because in the case of my own family, we have a very broad sense of humor. We laugh at lots of things. Sometimes it's dark humor when we're dealing with difficult things, and you have that in the world. And if you happen to encounter someone and they seem to be, and pardon the expression, if they seem to be a bit off, there may be something going on with them. And what I would ask is, in your experience of life, no matter what you're going through, especially if you're going through something rough, learn to have compassion for someone when you approach them. Because Alzheimer's dementia is not exclusively an older person's disease, but it's more common to see it in older people. When you approach a person, and whether you're watching them meander down the street, or maybe they're crossing a crosswalk and they just seem to be a bit out of it, it's not about honking your horn and telling them to hurry up and get out of the street. And to even say it, many of these individuals are experiencing this, and they're driving cars, or maybe they're riding bicycles, driving golf carts, whatever it is. For a lot of the things, they are able to manage and take care of themselves. And then there seems to reach a point where they can't. And then obviously we're more cognitive of that there's some sort of helplessness going on. But again, I raise the issue because as I have been out there in the world, and I have trained my awareness to be sensitive to people as they respond to me in ways that seem to be a bit different than what I would expect, then I'm a little more cautious as to what may be going on for them. And I try to point people in the right direction as best I can. Again, that's one of the benefits of being able to do a podcast and raise awareness of the topic. So if you happen to have a family member, or if you yourself may be experiencing something like this, it's certainly a time to enlist professional help. There are doctors who are trained in scoping out these things. Those who deal with older people, gerontologists, they deal with people who are older and issues affecting aging. But most doctors are trained at least to look at the signs and to be able to point you in the right direction. There are many websites that deal with the topic, and I would encourage you to do a little research on that, at least to get yourself informed and to become compassionate. And as I have heard that there are various charitable causes, it could be walks, fundraisers and things like that, to raise money for research for individuals who may be affected by those diseases. So it's to point out that if you are aware of somebody who may be afflicted with this, and or if it's your own relatives, mom, dad, or however that may land on you, again, my compassion, my heart goes out to you, because it is something that is very debilitating. And I had a very dear friend whose mother passed away very recently, and what I observed in her, that is my friend, is that she seemed to be very depressed, in that her mother was alive. She was a shell of herself, but she was not able to communicate with her. And the fact that at her passing, it seemed to be now that she knows that her mother is at peace. But I think one of the concerns going forward from this is when you are related, a blood relative to someone who has been affected by this, I think then the concern becomes, am I going to be affected? And that's definitely a valid concern. That would be something that you would want to look into with your professional healthcare provider, your doctor, and see if that's something that may happen to you. Hopefully, research will provide some not only answers, but things that we can do to delay the onset of these types of things. And for that, it would be time and money well spent. So, again, the subject of Alzheimer's and dementia. And I am going to take a break, and I'll be right back.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. Hey! The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
Hello there, and welcome back to Golden State Media Concepts Relationships Podcast. I'm your host, John Johnson, and in this segment, I'm going to talk about young love. It is something that, we're back in school in a lot of places right now, and, you're meeting people, and when you meet people, you might see that person that you just sort of have that chemistry with. Things sort of click. You have that opportunity to experience yourself, and as you're growing, there's lots of changes that are coming on, mostly hormonal changes, if not just, going taller and developing in all kinds of ways. I'm going to be correct here in how I represent it. But when I talk about young love, I know a lot of people think about the Romeo and Juliet story and how romantic that is. Of course, I mean, it's a bit tragic too. But the idea of romance oftentimes is portrayed in the media, and I say media, and I don't mean it in a disparaging way, but it gives a lot of glowing, it makes it seem easy. And, movies go from scene to scene, and it shows the transition. But oftentimes, and, you'll see this in coming-of-age films too, but oftentimes it doesn't necessarily address some of the how to deal with the problems. And, you've only got the space and time of what, an hour and some change, because that's just how movies and television are. But when I talk about some of the bigger aspects, I'm talking about, the responsibilities of being in a relationship. This is not just homework. It's not just a homework assignment that you do every day or every evening, and then you get to the end of the semester and you go to a new class. This is a stage of development that you transition into, that is discovering yourself, discovering what it feels like to have emotions for someone, and vulnerability and all of that, and then what to do with it. This is something that progresses on through the rest of your life. So I say the word young love, but I'm just talking about the beginning of it here. And I think it's important that when you start out in this, it's challenging enough, because a lot of this stuff isn't really explained to people. You could read books about it and live vicariously through your friends, but it's in experiencing it is when you become very engaged and become very aware of your own self. And I'm speaking primarily to young people, but obviously anybody who's listening to the podcast, if you're older, you can relate to it. It's that development stage and what you do with those feelings and those emotions. Quite often, people can remember that experience of seeing someone that they're attracted to. There's some sort of chemistry. There's that physical attraction, and it makes you want to be with that person. And I'm not talking just the sex. I'm really talking about, wow, there is just something about that individual. And when you get to be around that person, it makes you feel good. And that's some of the beauty of being young and experiencing this, because you have those feelings, and you can have them without necessarily all the sexual charge around it. It's just innocent and it's fun, and you try to spend time with each other. Well, the interesting thing about young people is that they're always connecting, establishing new connections, and that's part of youth as well. So it could be, you might feel that charge with many people, and then if it comes down to trying to decide that there is one person in particular you want to spend that time with, then you have sort of the awkward negotiation that may come with that. So I'm saying that as a listener, a young person who might be in experiencing this on their own, that's also part of the process. There's this negotiation, there's this dance that happens between you and the other person about some sort of exclusivity. And as you get older, that probably becomes something that's more important to you. You understand more about what committed relationships are, as opposed to just having a bunch of friendships or just a bunch of romances that tend to just happen. And also be aware of other people's perception. And when you're having these encounters, having these relationships with people, about establishing boundaries as to what's appropriate and what isn't. And oftentimes it's understanding that you have boundaries with how sexually involved you're going to be. And many schools have their programs in which they teach human sexuality. You have to get your parents' permission, and they sign a permission slip, and then you attend these classes, and they talk about reproductive things, and which is probably the thing that kids need to understand, that being sexually active, what it exposes you to. And not just having kids being young, but also the sexually transmitted diseases. That's a very important thing to understand as a young person, which helps you learn to why you want to establish boundaries. Because oftentimes there's, people tell us that we should do it, but why? And I think that's a very important conversation to have. But going back to having the experience of being around lots of people, and then developing that part of yourself that understands what committed relationships are and what friendships are, and about having boundaries. Now, those things are very important to understand, because it's usually in that aspect is when people have different perceptions about what's going to happen. And being able to discuss that young people are very inexperienced, I think, at having those kinds of conversations. But as you begin your life in the love zone or the young romance, these are going to be the kinds of things to expect. Also, and this is something else of a boundary, it's, alcohol and whether that should be involved. And I think every state I know of has an established age limit for alcohol consumption. Now, the thing to understand is alcohol lowers people's inhibitions, and by lowering people's inhibitions, it affects their judgment. And obviously, drinking and driving is a terrible conversation. Not conversation, but it's a terrible confluence of things. You shouldn't do it. It leads to terrible consequences. And I think most of us probably know someone who has had some experience with drugs or drinking, and alcohol is considered a drug, so that you understand that. But it leads to terrible consequences. So if you're even thinking about that combination of things, don't. It's the no-no. And it's been talked about over and over and over again. I don't want any of you to ever become a victim of that. But sadly, it's something that still happens to this day, even though we talk about it. Another thing is tobacco use. Among young people, it is on the decline. But to understand that what tobacco use does, and when a person, do your research. I think it is a very, very difficult habit to break if you are a smoker, and I have known many people that have tried to quit. It is a health hazard, and once you reach a certain point in the damage of your lungs, then a lot of it is irreversible. And I've known many people that have succumbed to lung cancer. So that's just one aspect. And so I'm talking about young love, and I've kind of waxed and gone into some of these other topics, such as sexuality, drug use, alcohol, tobacco. But getting back to the emotional, mental aspect of what it's like to venture into that, and realize again that this is something that's going to be part of a progression on the rest of your life. We all tend to experience it in our own way. And you as an individual are going to experience it at your speed, and you don't expect yourself to do it at the speed of someone else. And someone else may have a different experience with it because they have different opportunities to do things, and whether it's experimenting with stuff, and that doesn't have to be your experience. So don't feel like you have to be at the same level of someone else. And if you're a person who tends to be more subdued, more of a recluse, and you're not out there, well, obviously you're not going to be the same as someone who is socially very, very popular. They may have more choices, and that's okay. That's just not your lot in life, at least not at this point. So again, to young people listening to that, don't feel like you are necessarily missing out on something. You're living your life too, and how it's supposed to play out. But as you begin to experience these things, which may cause emotional roller coasters, realize that is a part of life. And if things become more into the extreme, then find yourself, and if you're a young person who, there's school counselors that you can talk to about this. There are professional counselors who deal with emotional, mental health issues. And if you're a college person who is maybe venturing out and experiencing this for the first time, because and that's very practical. You may have your first really deep encounter because it may be the first time that you have left home. You may have lived in a home that may have been very conservative, or you didn't have a lot of opportunities maybe in high school to go out and to date, and you start to find these experiences happen for you in college. There again, if this all applies to you, that you're going to learn things at your own pace, and expect that and be okay with that. You don't have to live up to someone else's standard. But as you encounter other individuals and learn about their experiences, it's good to be vocal, be verbal. Think about yourself and your experiences, journal things, and, give yourself the benefit of the doubt, and learn to love yourself. And if it comes to, experiencing love and other people and other experiences, and you're feeling, say you're not feeling good about it, well, then take a step back and evaluate it. But again, this is about loving yourself, and enjoying your life. When I think about the first girlfriend I had when I was really young, I remember being teased about it. And you know what? It was just a title that they threw on things. We weren't doing anything bad. We were just sitting next to each other and probably coloring things and just enjoying being in the space. But I realized that awkward feeling of being watched, because I guess I felt like somebody was expecting me to do something that I wouldn't ordinarily do. And I just learned really to get along much better. And I think when you feel like you're around somebody you really care about, you're more compelled to want to cooperate and to want to be with that person. And that's a wonderful thing to experience, because I think you learn you learn to empathy, compassion for other people. And that's a part of your growth. And I think that's something that's very good to carry with you, to take forward in your life, whenever it happens for you. Love is a wonderful thing, and it can be also very painful to deal with. It has the capacity to make you reach beyond anything that you ever thought was imaginable for yourself. That is because you love someone else. And so it's very powerful. So when you think about it in those terms, it has big consequences. So as a young person who is experiencing something like that, you're embarking upon a very long journey that will be for the rest of your life. And may you experience the best of yourself and someone else in that journey. I'm your host, John Johnson, and this is the Golden State Media Concepts Relationships Podcast, episode 24. I was talking about dementia and Alzheimer's and about young love. Thank you for joining me, and join me next time at Golden State Media Concepts Relationships Podcast.